Guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you, and today I've got an interesting side-by-side comparison. This, of course, is the Riot Torrent. If you've been around this channel for any length of time, you know that this is one of my all-time favorite knives, and this, unless you've been living under a rock or just not part of the knife community, you also recognize right away as the Hinderer XM18. This, of course, has the tri-way pivot, making these rather comparable. And here's what I want to talk about today. I think, number one, the Hinderer explains an awful lot about why I like the Riot Torrent as much as I do, but both of these knives do some really, really cool things that I wish were much more common. And so what I want to talk about is when we're going to make sort of a hard use tactical type of folder that's a little more able, okay, than some of the EDC style folding knives we might be carrying, then I think these knives offer some really, really good input, some really, really good examples. The utility of a knife, right, has long been recognized, and many of us, if you're at all like me, then you understand that there's a great deal of value in being able to have a knife with you all the time. Now, the problem is that a fixed blade isn't perfectly suited to be carried all day, every day, everywhere you go. You've got to wear a belt. It may be too big. It may not fit. You know, if you've ever had a fixed blade in a sheath on a belt and tried to sit in your car for a prolonged period of time, you know it can be a bit of a challenge. Okay, so we recognize that there's a good deal of value in having a capable cutting tool that folds, so that now I can fold this up. I'm only dealing with the size of the handle. Yes, that does bring in some limitations to, you know, what we're doing here with this tool, but we're willing to trade off. We're willing to sacrifice some of the strength and utility of a fixed blade to get the convenience and size of a folder. All right. And these knives, by the way, I should say this too. When I got into knives, the hard use folder was the thing. It was like 2011, 2012. And I mean, I've always carried a knife with me ever since I was a little kid, but before I wouldn't have considered myself a part of the knife community. I didn't really know much about it. It wasn't until, I don't know, 2009 or 2010 when I got a Rat Model 1. And then from there, I carried the Rat Model 1 for 2 or 3 years and then decided I wanted to get into, look at some other stuff. And that kind of got me going. So back then, it was all about heavy duty, hard use knives. I remember watching Jim Skeleton's channel, and everything that he showed had like 1/4 inch thick slabs of titanium and ridiculously heavy and large and overbuilt everything. Now, the overbuilt trend primarily meant that you would have thick slabs of titanium and thick blade stock, and that's about it. And I think you understand that that's not all that's required to make a knife hard use. Okay, and really what we care more about, or what we should care more about, are the components and the durability of those components and the strength of those components. That's a better expression of hard use. And sadly, back then, Chris Reeve sort of got overshadowed a little bit. Now, Chris Reeve did have the Umnumzon and the Inkosi. I guess the Inkosi is a little, or I guess the Umnumzon and the 25, which were kind of harder use. And the funny thing was, they didn't often get the reputation of being hard use because they weren't thick and heavy enough. Meanwhile, they had components that were better built and would withstand the rigors of use way better and way longer than a lot of the other competitors, especially ZT, which was a major player at the time. And so back then, zero tolerance, shortly after I got into the knife world, or maybe even before, the zero tolerance 0560 was coming out, and it was based off sort of the XM18, but sort of probably more so based off the XM24. And so Hinderers were wildly popular and wildly influential at the time, and rightly so. It was a great knife. It still is a great knife, and it was so hard to get your hands on back then. These days, it's a little easier. Now, right now, there seems to be a bit of a lull, probably because of COVID. But most of the time these days, if you want an XM18, you can get one at any retailer or on the secondary market. They're not that expensive and they're not that hard to find. All right, but back then they were really hard to find. They were really expensive. You'd have to sign up for email lists. They'd sell out instantly. It was ridiculous. The PM2 was the same. Now now we've moved away from that, and we've moved into these weird sort of small runs from specific makers where, instead of trying to partner with a production company or get your knife made by someone, or make it, I guess, yourself, you find an OEM and you get everyone to sign up, and then everyone who signs up and pays the $100 up front or whatever gets one of your 100 knives that you're going to make. And I understand the economy of that, and the accessibility of that for especially a small maker who's not interested in starting his own production facility. Anyway, that's the world we're in now. But back then, it wasn't like that. Rick Hinderer was making these knives in a fairly small shop, and they were not that easy to get, and they were wildly popular. Now, around all that time, it was a little past that. Probably around the time when the 0562 became super popular, which I guess would be like 2014, 2015, Riat started to emerge, and I guess they had a little bit before that, but they came out over the years. And I tried a few Riats. I'm a big fan of Riat knives. One of the knives they came out with, kind of just past their initial popularity, was the Torrent. And when I saw this knife, I fell in love immediately. Now, what is this knife doing that I liked? Well, guess what? It was borrowing a lot of stuff from Zero Tolerance and a lot of stuff from Hinderer that I really, really appreciate. Okay, so both of these knives are a little on the heavy duty side. They're fairly thick components. They're fairly large. The blade stock is pretty substantial. Okay. And Riat took a lot of those trends, and I would say almost perfected them in the Torrent, because they gave me a big, thick, heavy stock with lots of material out toward the tip, beautifully ground, still though a little thinner than most of what was being done out there, certainly thinner than a lot of the ZTs that were available, and thinner behind the edge than the XM18, a little bit bigger M390, which wasn't everywhere. The other thing they've done from Hinderer is gone with the external stop pins. And this is a great, great feature. Look at the size of those pins and imagine the force that would be required to get them to move. That is really, really well done. Now, of course, Hinderer did that first. I can't tell you. I'm trying to think if there are other models that were doing that. I don't know that there were. I think Rick might have been the first guy to put these through here and create this whole triangle of strength. Okay, which is what I'm going to call that. I'm going to patent that. Rick or anyone from Hinderer, if you're watching this, you cannot use triangle of strength. You have to pay me a commission in order to do that. No, just kidding. But the triangle idea was really, really good. So what keeps this blade moving from moving side to side is these stop pins, which are going to interact with the frame, as well as the pivot here. And that means very little. And then, of course, these are engaged by the force exerted by the lock bar. Okay, so that means you're going to get very little movement. And when you apply that side-to-side pressure, it's being applied to the frame through this pin, and it's being applied to the pivot screw rather than on a typical knife. What have I got here that's a good example? I had a cold steel sitting here a few minutes ago. I don't know what I've done with it. Anyway, on your typical, Spyderco Benchmade cold steel, whatever, what you have is, you've got the blade and you've got two handle scales beside it. And here you've got a couple of washers, and the washers are the bearing interface between the blade and the scales. And those bearings, and those washers, which I guess are bearing, but those washers have to be the thing that stabilizes the blade side to side. All right. That's an okay system. And I will say of the options that use that system, Chris Reeve does it the best, okay, because he's got these great big washers that provide a lot of stability and a lot of strength. However, the XM18 took a different route and went with this triangle. And the triangle is another really, really good option. And one of the reasons I love the Torrent is because it uses that same triangle. Okay, now the other thing the Torrent did is following ZT and a few others, provided fantastic action. A snappy detent, dual row ceramic bearings, which are really, really nice and extremely noticeable. The action on this knife is just superb. The action on this is good. And this, of course, is the tri-way pivot with the bearings installed. Hinderer has done some nice work on their detent. It's definitely improved. And the tri-way pivot is nice. What's especially nice about the triangle option that both of these have is that you reduce the amount of strain on those internal bearings. So it doesn't matter as much which choice you go with. Even, Hinderer was going to use totally Teflon washers in here. And the Teflon, you go, well, wouldn't Teflon sort of compress and flex as it undergoes forces? And yes, it would to some degree. However, it was protected from those forces by the system that Hinderer used to by the lugs keeping the blade where they belong, keeping the blade where it belongs when faced with lateral torsion. Okay, the other thing that Hinderer did here was create a pretty thick blade and a pretty thick stock. Now, is that necessary? Is that desirable? Probably not. I mean, it's somewhat desirable. You don't want your blade to break, okay? But the Riot has gone a little bit thinner, okay? And in terms of features that work really, really well, I would lean towards a thinner blade. I want that strength. I want that durability in an EDC style knife or in a hard use tactical style knife. But I will also readily admit that a knife is a cutting tool primarily. And the force that it really needs to be able to deal with is this force. Okay, this is what it needs to be good at. And the Torrent is very good. And you can notice a significant difference. Whoops. Between the Torrent and the XM. All right, you can see the XM still cuts, and it still cuts reasonably well, but if you were here in my shoes pushing those two blades through the cardboard, you would know that this bites way easier. That cut starts easier, and it just cuts a little bit nicer overall. The action is also a little bit nicer. Now, the big question would be design-wise, which one do you prefer? And I'm really on the fence. I actually love both of these designs. If you want something that leans a little more to the gentlemanly side, you might like the Torrent a little more. If you like something that leans more to the tool, hard use, tactical looking side, you'll probably like the Hinderer. The price is also significant. Now, let me say, you can buy a Hinderer on the secondary market. I mean, wow. You can buy a Torrent on the secondary market for a pretty reasonable price. I think, I've seen them between $200 and $250. I've seen Hinderers for between $300 and $350. So $100 more for, some differences. American made for sure, which is not anything to sneeze at. All right, now if you want to go to the tri-way pivot, you're probably going to be stuck paying retail at $425 for that, which is not unheard of, especially considering the competition out there. Lots of U.S. made high-end manufacturers are $600-$700 because of the demand for them, which is a little bit insane. Just as an aside, right, the Holt Spectre is wildly popular, and it's a great $500 knife, but that's it, right? The Koenig Arius, they haven't bumped up in price as much. They're still expensive. I think you can still go get a base model for like $550, which is pretty good. And the Arius is a fantastic knife, without a doubt. But even at, once you get into secondary prices, which can be higher, to me, it loses a lot of its appeal. Anyway, let's get back to the discussion that we're having here, and that is about features. So if you want to make a hard use knife, I think these knives offer really, really good input on what to look for and what on how to make it. So I want a pivot that's reliable. I want a blade grind that's very capable, but a little bit on the tougher side. And I want a handle that's large and comfortable and locks me in. And both of these do that. The jimping is a little finer on the Torrent than the heavier jimping on the Hinderer. The other thing is both of them can be choked up on, which I love. Last thing I want to touch on here is the lock bar. Both of these are accessible. The tension is good. The detent is great. But I want you to notice this detail right here. You see that little extra piece? That adds strength to the lock bar cutout. And I wish that companies like Hinderer and ZT and others would start doing that. Ferrum Forge does do it on a lot of their knives. They add, that sort of serves as, think about if you had a 2x4, okay, how strong is a 2x4? Well, if you took another 2x4 and nailed it right here, what happens? Right, you vastly improve the strength of that. And by cutting these relief cuts with that extra piece, you do the same thing. You improve the strength in a pretty substantial way. And I think you could do more with this. I would love to see a maker who takes some time to figure out exactly what is the best way of doing that and does a lot of destruction tests to figure out where these fail and how to keep them from failing that way. That's not me. I'm not an engineer and I'm not a CAD designer. And I don't have a mill that I can make 100 frame locks and test them all to failure. But I do think that would be an interesting endeavor. So if somebody's out there that would like to engage in that, I would welcome the research and be happy to share it in my videos. Okay, there you go, guys. That's the discussion that I want to have. There were a few points that these two knives share in common that I really wanted to touch on. And I also wanted to share this by way of explanation. Often people wonder why I like the Torrent so much. And that's why. This is doing some things that are really, really good and not commonly found in all hard use or claimed to be hard use folders. And so is this. Of course, a lot of the ideas came from here. And so I wanted to take a look at these two knives side by side. First, acknowledge that this is heavily influenced by this, but also acknowledge that these are sharing some things that make for a really, really excellent high-end tactical folder. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to check the channel sponsors down below, especially White Mountain Knives and Southern Edge Knife Works. I'll link them down in the description where you can use my discount code SHARPSTUFF and save yourself a bit of money. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you soon.